class. This is an online lecture of Chapter 12, Bianco and Cannon, on the presidency. I know you've already had a lecture in class, but I thought a lecture from me online might make you feel more confident in the midterm and just in general feel better prepared. So, let's begin. Bianco and Cannon, first off, break down the presidency, explaining it in a way that I think is really helpful. They explore the presidency in 4 points. First, they determine presidents matter. For example, look at the changes that they've made despite all the obstacles like separation of powers and what the Federalist Papers said that they would or would not do, but more importantly, what the Constitution says that they could or could not do. Secondly, presidents get their power from a variety of sources, not just from the Constitution. For example, sometimes public support allows the president to finagle even more power. In instances of national security, the public, and often Congress and even the courts, will automatically defer to the president as commander-in-chief and allow him to make sweeping policy changes that would otherwise not be accepted without the approval of Congress and the courts. Number 3. Presidential power has increased over time, a lot, but not because the Constitution has changed. Mainly, it's because of how the nation has grown. Consider the executive branch alone. It's expanded. There are now 15 presidential cabinets. These are areas where the president is basically the CEO. And the nation has grown because now government touches a lot of areas in our lives. So some of the things we're going to look at is how the president affects things like healthcare with the Affordable Care Act, which comes out of one of his cabinets, the Department of Health and Human Services. Finally, number 4, Bianco and Cannon want you to look at the presidency in terms of their distinct limits to presidential power. So even though we're going to be studying how expansive the presidential power is, there are limits, and among those are the regular limits that we talked about before with separation of powers, like Congress and the Supreme Court. But there are other limits too. For example, foreign opposition can limit what the president does. And especially public opinion plays a particularly important role in what the presidency is allowed to do and what he's not. It can even stop some of the separation of powers. For example, if Congress is apt to stop the president from making an executive order, they have to pass legislation. But if the public is in favor of that executive order, Congress will likely not interfere with that for fear of the public not liking what they're doing. So we see public opinion plays a huge role, and we'll talk more about that later. All right, now first, let's get into what the Constitution has to say about the presidency. So the president has specific constitutional duties. These are the most direct ways that the presidency matters. He has specified duties that are enumerated in the Constitution. Let's look at what he can do according to the Constitution, because we're also going to look what he can do not according to the Constitution. Now, remember, presidential powers are found in Article 2. Out of Article 2, we see the following duties, and I'm going to paraphrase here. And you're welcome to paraphrase the same way that I do here in his duties if, for example, on the midterm, I ask you to name at least 3 presidential duties that are enumerated in the Constitution. So feel free again to use my wording. So in no particular order, he is the commander-in-chief of the military. He can grant reprieves and pardons. He can make treaties with the consent of the Senate, of course. In general, he's given authority to appoint a lot of officers at various levels in the federal government. For example, he can nominate ambassadors, public ministers, Supreme Court judges, all, of course, with the approval of the Senate. He can fill vacancies in the Senate as well, but only during the recess of the Senate. If need be, he can call a special session in Congress. He can give an address on the State of the Union. In the State of the Union address, This is where he discusses his vision for policy and is supposed to be used to merely make recommendations to Congress. Because remember, the executive branch is not supposed to legislate. That is the job of the legislature. So, all right, so these are the duties in the Constitution. Now, usually, political science textbooks break down presidential duties by the role that he plays as president. So he has these roles. For example, the chief of state, which is similar to what we'll call the head of state, or the chief executive, which refers to the fact that he's over the cabinet, the chief diplomat, referring to his powers with foreign relations, commander-in-chief, which of course refers to the military, chief legislature. We'll learn that the president has a lot more power in legislating, not specifically legislating, but pretty much like it in a variety of ways. The chief of the party, whoever is president, what party he belongs to, he is the head of that party. So President Obama is the head of the Democratic Party. And finally, the popular leader, and that refers to the amount of support that he can garner among the public and what that can do for him in terms of allowing his policy to go through. So in all these roles, I like breaking down the presidency in this way. I think it demonstrates two things really well. One, presidential power has grown tremendously. And two, it shows how these additional powers that the president has picked up along the way has become legitimate in the eye of the public and in the eye of the other branches too. Now, if you've read Chapter 12 already, you know that the president has the power to issue executive orders. We accept this power, but the president hasn't always had this power, and it's not stated in the Constitution. These orders, executive orders, are a way for the president to push his agenda while avoiding Congress, so he doesn't have to push it through legislation. Typically, we treat these executive orders as a form of law, but in the past we see the Supreme Court does not recognize executive orders as a form of law. Now, usually it's viewed, executive orders that is, as an overreach of executive authority, especially when the executive order isn't popular. For example, recently, Congress could not or would not deal with immigration reform in the way that President Obama envisioned. In 2014, he issued several executive orders dealing with immigration and deportation, trying to make sure that families weren't split up. In his speech, he announced these executive orders, and it was very controversial. You might even remember it. Yet, before, we've accepted executive orders from presidents without a fight. In fact, President Obama reminded us of that. He said, quote, "These are actions I have the legal authority to take as president. The same kinds of actions taken by Democratic and Republican presidents before me that will help make our immigration system more fair and more just." But states still sued because this use of power is technically not constitutional. The Supreme Court has actually signaled to the president that they're inclined to agree with the states that this power is unconstitutional and that it was indeed an overreach. So now, and this is just a side note, now the federal government is fighting. They're fighting these executive orders and allowing them to persist in a lower federal court. So that's just a side note about the lower federal court. It may seem really confusing to learn that the office of the president has this official authority granted by the Constitution, and over the course of many years, the office has gained additional authority that technically aren't laws, but still we treat as laws. So let me put this in perspective for you. Your book does a great job of this. It notes that the president has two types of authority: constitutional authority and statutory authority. So constitutional authority are powers derived from the provisions in the Constitution that describe the president's role. Now, your book also notes the statutory authority of the president. These are powers that come from the laws from Congress that allow the president additional authority in certain areas. We'll talk about at least one of these instances. You'll find that some of the powers we discuss here are derived from statutory power, like executive order, and it's kind of akin to what we talked about in Congress with the necessary and proper clause. There are provisions in the Constitution that Congress uses to justify legislation that is seemingly unconstitutional. But if they can connect it to a power that's already in the Constitution, like the necessary and proper clause, then their actions can be seen as legitimate and legal. You'll see the executive operates in this way too, looking for things in the Constitution that can justify additional actions. In fact, all the branches do. The judicial branch does this, and even the invisible branch, the bureaucracy that we talked about, the fourth branch, does this as well. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution is the vesting clause. This makes the president the head of government and the head of state. The vesting clause states, quote, "The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America," end quote. If this clause seems really vague to you, and you don't really see how it makes the president the head of government and head of state, then you're not alone. I didn't leave anything out. That is it. The meaning of the clause is really heavily debated because of it. So we've got two schools of thought here. The one is that, listen, this is just a phrase. The executive power is invested in the president of the United States. Duh. But then we've got another school of thought that looks at this clause and says, this can be interpreted to be really broad and to allow the president to do a lot of things that aren't specifically stated because, well, at the time, the founders didn't know what the president would have to do as the nation grew. So this clause was to allow that power to grow. So you can decide what you think about that. Nevertheless, though, we consider the president to be the head of the government. This refers to the president being in charge of the executive branch. And if you think about it, that is quite a lot of power, especially since now the president's cabinet's up to 15 departments. So the vesting clause also allows the president to be the head of state, but this part isn't at all controversial because the head of state doesn't really do much. It's merely a ceremonial role. In fact, you can think of this as the role that Queen Elizabeth has in Great Britain. In Britain, they have these two roles, the head of state and the head of government, separate. The Queen is the ceremonial lead, but all this allows her to do is declare a day to be Talk Like a Pirate Day, if she wanted. David Cameron, who's the Prime Minister, that may be extra credit on a test, by the way. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is what we would call the head of government. Now, both of these powers, like I said, are vested in the president in U.S. government. But I'm just trying to give you something to compare it to. Cameron actually implements the government. This is legislation, acts of parliament. For lack of a better term, Queen Elizabeth just simply puts her stamp of approval on things. Now, she is required to sign off on laws that Parliament makes. But even if she didn't sign off on the laws, they would still be laws. All right, now let's go back and discuss the president as the head of government some more. The Constitution also says that, quote, "The president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed," end quote. And your book doesn't note this, but this is known as a lot of different things. Some people call it the take care clause. Some people call it the faithful execution clause. Now, sometimes, so the president's job in general, this is pretty clear. You got to make sure the laws are faithfully executed. And sometimes this happens automatically. The president has to do very little. For example, and this is very relevant because of the recent flooding that we've had. So in 2014, Congress passed a law that raised the federal cost of flood insurance for homeowners. If you didn't know this, you don't get flood insurance from people like State Farm, or if you have renter's insurance, I'm sure many of you have apartments. Your renter's insurance does not include flood insurance. You have to get it through the government. So a law was passed from Congress that raised the federal cost of flood insurance for homeowners in flood-prone areas. FEMA, which is the obvious agency that would implement this, simply just adjusted the cost. That was it. That's all that needed to be done. So the president wasn't overly worried about making sure that that got done. FEMA did it. His role as the president's role as the head of government gives him a lot of latitude in some ways, actually in a lot of ways. So remember when we talked about the bureaucracy? We talked about Congress passing really vague legislation, and then they would let the policy experts in the bureaucratic agency fill in the blanks, essentially writing legislation. And they would do this through the rulemaking process, which we went through. Now, many of these bureaucratic agencies that we talked about the other day are under the executive branch. In fact, all cabinets under the executive branch. Take a look at the diagram. It's in front of you right now. This diagram is of the executive department, and it's actually in chapter 13 about the bureaucracy. But this is a diagram of what we call the executive department of the president, the EOP. These are a group of policy-related offices that serves as support staff to the president. Of course, you see that cabinets are a part of the EOP. The president makes appointments to these cabinet positions, to head up these cabinet positions, and these are the frontline implementers of the president's agenda. So if you were to ask, or if I were to ask you on a midterm, what the cabinets can do for the presidency and what they're supposed to do for the president, they're supposed to be the frontline implementers of the president's agenda. And it makes sense, right? It also makes sense that when he appoints these positions, and we call them secretaries of the cabinets, so when he appoints these positions, like the Secretary of the Department of Energy or the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, he'll select people who are, of course, loyal and who have the same policy goals as him. On the flip side, what do you think the chances are that a secretary will go against what the president wants in policy implementation? Your answer should be pretty slim, right? So they're likely going to do exactly what the president wants them to do. Otherwise, the secretary will lose her job. She is at the whim of the president. Her job is, that is. There are a few examples, well, actually there was very few examples of the president outright firing his staff because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Most of the time, what we see then is the president will just ask the secretary to resign, but the president won't officially ask, it'll just happen. The secretary will know that it's time to leave. So when President Lincoln, going all the way back to the 1860s, when President Lincoln was assassinated, President Andrew Johnson took office. Members in Congress thought that Johnson might be a little too sympathetic to the South, so they're trying. This is the Reconstruction era of trying to get the nation unified again, and they were afraid that he might be too sympathetic to the South because he was from Tennessee. And turns out, Johnson was very sympathetic to the South. To keep Lincoln's legacy alive, or really to keep the policies of the Republican Party alive, Congress needed to be sure that Johnson didn't fire any of the cabinet members that were faithfully supporting President Lincoln's policies, or again, the Republican Party's policies. So they passed the Tenure of Office Act, which required Senate approval before a president dismissed cabinet members. President Johnson kept trying to dismiss the Secretary of War. Unfortunately, his attempts led the House to vote for his impeachment. He passed the Senate and wasn't asked to leave office. It was by one vote that he was allowed to stay, so it was very close. And then later, this particular law, the Tenure of Office Act, in 1926, it was called unconstitutional. Woodrow Wilson was trying to fire a lower-level postal worker, and the postal worker, when Woodrow Wilson tried to fire him, took it to the Supreme Court, saying that the Tenure of Office Act did not allow this. That's when the Supreme Court said, but the president is in charge of this branch. He has the power to appoint and to fire. So they ruled the Tenure of Office Act unconstitutional. Generally, though, like I said, presidents won't have to fire individuals. They'll just resign, sometimes in deep embarrassment. The Affordable Care Act is a really great example, and I know I talk about this a lot, but it's very timely, and it's a really great example of the president's agencies gaining control over policy implementation. It's also a good example of somebody having to resign because of the connection to the president. So here's the story. The implementation of the healthcare plan I mentioned was and is implemented by the Department of Health and Human Services. So President Obama selected Kathleen Sebelius. She was a Democrat from Kansas, and she was selected as secretary. The legislation left the department a lot of latitude in the implementation of the law, and it did not go well. And you can imagine there was a lot of latitude because in order to even get legislation like the Affordable Care Act passed, they had to leave a lot of specific wording out to make it as bipartisan as possible. Democrats get too specific, Republicans aren't going to like it. Republicans get too specific, Democrats aren't going to like it. So it's really vague. So you can imagine that it was a lot of latitude, and of course it was, but it didn't go well. Now, as the lead of the agency, she was, of course, to blame for this. And by extension, President Obama was also to blame because she was his right-hand woman when it comes to the Department of Health and Human Services. She ended up resigning in 2014 after a really tenuous road full of congressional hearings, having to answer for just a really disastrous rollout of the healthcare program. The New York Times wrote this, actually. This is from April 10th, 2014. Quote, officials said Ms. Sebelius made the decision to resign and was not forced out. But the frustration at the White House over her performance had become increasingly clear, as administrative aides worried that the crippling problems at healthcare.gov, the website set up to enroll Americans in insurance exchanges, would result in lasting damage to the president's legacy, end quote. Later in the same article, the Times wrote, quote, the president had been under pressure for months to fire Ms. Sebelius, but he resisted. In part, he didn't want the Department of Health and Human Services to undergo any more upheaval amid all of these problems that were plaguing healthcare.gov. So he wanted to maintain some consistency. Right, back to what the Times said. In part, because of his general reluctance to publicly rebuke top officials too. So it doesn't really behoove a president, if you think about it, to fire his cabinet members because it may be evidence that he made a bad decision. Which brings me to a second point. The president, I mentioned, selects these secretaries, these appointments. He selects them based on the party that he's involved in because those are that's the agenda that he wants to see through. And of course, he selects based on loyalty. But what also matters is expertise. So Sebelius needed to be a good public administrator. She needed to know her health and human services, whatever that entails. She needed to be an expert. So he has to select based on expertise too. And he does that. For example, you see here the Department of Energy Secretary is actually a nuclear physicist, Dr. Ernest Moniz. I hope I'm saying his name right. It might seem very easy for the president's policy to be implemented by his selected cabinet members. That is, as long as they don't botch it because of their inability to administer. But remember that employees in these agencies, aside from the secretaries, are all civil servants. And these are people that are employed based on merit. They're not appointed, and these civil servants may not be as amenable to the president's agenda. And if the secretary can't control her office employees, then problems in the administration begin to creep up, and we see incidents like what happened with healthcare.gov and the Affordable Care Act. There are actually more direct ways that the president can orchestrate his agenda. He has the power to pass executive orders. These are proclamations made by the president that change government without congressional approval. So these orders, your book says, unilaterally changes government policy without subsequent congressional consent. You might ask, and I hope you do ask, why would Congress allow this? Well, sometimes they don't have a choice, or rather, sometimes it's better not to allow it, or to allow it. Let me explain. It's true that Congress could pass legislation that would overturn an executive order, or any other order like, for example, a presidential directive. But remember the last chapter we looked at, chapter 11, and look how hard it is to get a law passed. So many laws get introduced, and only about 5% of them, and that's a big percentage, actually gets to the law phase. So it goes through so many hurdles. Now, let's just say that President Obama ordered Executive Order X. Then Congress doesn't like it. They manage to push a bill through the House and the Senate that overturns Executive Order X. But the bill still has to go through the president. The president can veto. Obviously, since the president proposed X, he'll veto any legislation that attempts to nullify it, right? So then Congress has to consider also, knowing that this bill will inevitably be vetoed by the president, they'll have to muster enough votes for congressional override. The whole process is just full of hurdles that must be overcome by Congress, and in the end, it really allows for executive orders to persist. One example of an executive order is when President Obama responded to the Sandy Hook shooting. President Obama signed a document that directed the Consumer Product Safety Commission to develop new requirements for gun locks specifically. This was just one of 23 executive orders that he signed during that time. Your book notes that executive orders sometimes are not quite as overreaching as you might think. Not all of them are like the immigration reform that President Obama tried to push through, but that's up for debate. But sometimes the president is, when he's pushing these orders, he's trying to find ways to respond to public outcry for action because sometimes it takes so long for Congress to act. And in this case, Congress passed a law that gave the president authority in this particular area being developing new requirements for gun locks. So Congress gave him authority to make those orders. Notice, though, that this type of an executive order is kind of administrative. And administrative orders are generally the areas where Congress might give the president some leeway in terms of making executive orders. Still, though, according to the Congressional Research Service, there is no direct, quote, definition of executive orders, presidential memoranda, and proclamations in the U.S. Constitution. There is likewise no specific provision authorizing their issuance, end quote. Now, right now, there's a lot of debate about whether President Obama is abusing executive orders. I mentioned that the Supreme Court even signaled to him that if the cases went up to the Supreme Court would, of course, deem it unconstitutional. Now, all this is because of the recent immigration order that he implemented. But he's hardly the first president to use executive orders. In fact, he's only issued about 183 in his time as president. That's over 2 terms. George W. Bush ordered 291. President Clinton ordered 364. Ronald Reagan ordered 381. And even Jimmy Carter ordered 320. He just served for 1 term. So all of these issued executive orders. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our New Deal president, issued the most executive actions, a total of 3,522 in his 3 terms. He did a tremendous job with issuing executive orders. And by the way, these are all numbers from what you're looking at right now from the American Presidency Project at the University of South Carolina, Santa Barbara, and the National Archives. And this is from a report conducted by PBS. Now, let's look at the president's legitimate powers. like treaty making and foreign policy. Those belong to the president. Treaty making with foreign governments is, of course, though, a shared power with the president and the Senate. So the president and his staff negotiates the terms of the treaty, but the Senate has to approve it. They have to approve it with 2/3 majority. There's an easier way to pass treaties through the fast track authority. The fast track authority is an authority granted to the president by Congress via a law. It generally relates to trade agreements, and it allows the treaty to pass the House and the Senate with a simple majority in each chamber, but no amendments can be made in the process. But again, the fast track authority is a power that's granted to the president by Congress. There are instances, though, when the president can actually bypass congressional constraints. For example, voluntary compliance is a way that he can implement treaties without getting support of the Senate or the 2/3 majority of the Senate. He completely bypasses them. Voluntary compliance is a way that involves public support. So the president simply announces that the U.S. will voluntarily comply with said treaty. Without the formal agreement, calling it a treaty, like without the U.S. actually formally agreeing, it doesn't have to go through the Senate. But the voluntary announcement by our head of government and head of state puts the rest of government in a position to back them, because otherwise we would look really unstable and disunified as a government. The second method that the president can use to bypass the Senate when making treaties is through something we call executive agreement. It has all the bells and whistles of a treaty because it's an agreement between two executives of a state. But again, it doesn't have to go through Congress because technically, not a treaty, just an agreement. In the same category as many other presidential duties we have talked about before, so now we are leaving, just to be clear, we are leaving legitimate duties of the president now. We're going to talk about something called executive privilege. Executive privilege is not in the Constitution. It's not really derived from any statute or law, but presidents simply claim to have it. It refers to the ability for a president to shield himself and his subordinates from revealing White House discussion decisions, documents, to the judicial or legislative branches. It gives them freedom to be able to say what they're going to say and do what they're going to do without worrying about somebody taking their words and making something different of them, all of that. So they can claim that executive privilege can make the claim that meetings, documents, things like that are secret, and they shouldn't have to release them to the judicial branch or the legislative branch if the legislative branch is performing an oversight. President Nixon is probably the most famous. It's the most famously used executive privilege during the infamous Watergate scandal. And since that happened so many years ago, let me tell you the story of what happened with President Nixon and Watergate. This is what you all know of. You've probably heard the "I am not a crook" that President Nixon said. This is what he said about this Watergate scandal. So here we go. Watergate was actually the location of the Democratic National Headquarters. Remember that President Nixon was Republican. In 1972, there was a break-in at Watergate, the DNC. 5 men were arrested, and it turns out that the men bugged the DNC headquarters. Now, Nixon was implicated because the break-in was traced back to him and his re-election committee. He tried to cover it up. Money was given to the men who broke in to keep quiet, and that's how they traced it back to the re-election committee because that's where the money came from to keep the men quiet. They got arrested. During this investigation, it came out that he was using, in addition to all this other stuff, he was using the CIA and the FBI to keep tabs on and harass activist groups that he opposed. All of these illegal actions eventually led to his resignation. The evidence was insurmountable that he was guilty of all of these illegal activities, and he was absolutely certain that the Senate would convict him and force him out of office. So, in order to avoid being a president that was kicked out of office, he resigned, seemingly on his own terms. The problem with this, and rather the connection to executive privilege with this, is that a lot of the evidence used against Nixon were tape recordings of him organizing or participating in these activities. And he declined to hand the tape recordings over to the courts under the auspices of executive privilege. He says, I don't have to, I have executive privilege, these are my own recordings. The prosecutors of the case challenged this at the Supreme Court level, and Nixon was forced to hand over the tapes. Everything that he said was covered under executive privilege. The point here is that sometimes executive privilege doesn't work, but sometimes it does. So let me give you an example of when executive privilege worked really well, and it's a current example. It's actually a really fun example because it's almost like a movie, and I'm not sure that this got enough press to where you might have heard about it, but you might have. So let's get to it. The ATF, known as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF was involved in what we call the ATF gun walking scandal. It's mostly known, though, as Operation Fast and Furious, which is a super cool name. Sometimes the ATF used gun walking, and I'll explain gun walking a little bit later, as a tactic to track down illegally purchased firearms. So there's a specific field office, an ATF field office in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, actually. And they ran a series of sting operations where the ATF purposefully allowed licensed firearm dealers to sell weapons to illegal straw buyers. The hope was to track the guns to Mexican drug cartel leaders and arrest them. These operations were done under the umbrella of a project called Project Gunrunner, and it was intended to find the flow of illegal firearms into Mexico. That's just kind of a side note. So basically, the ATF allowed licensed gun stores and merchants to sell guns to known criminals, which is illegal. I hope I don't have to say, but just in case I'll say it, it's illegal. The purchases would be tracked, that was the plan anyway, as they were transferred from the low-level people that were buying them, that's what we called the straw buyers, to the higher-level traffickers and all of the key figures and Mexican cartels. All of this with the expectation that this would lead to these head cartel leaders' arrests and the dismantling eventually of the Mexican cartels. Now, the ATF sold about 2,000 firearms to these known criminals, but only about 710 were recovered as of 2012. And that number actually fluctuates depending on what source you get it from. Some say only 300. I think 700 is probably a good number. Even if you say 700, that still leaves over 1,000 guns out there unaccounted for in the hands of cartel leaders that the U.S. government actually sold. So here's what happened. Again, many straw purchasers, these are low-level individuals in the cartels who were paid a small amount of money to purchase the guns, they've been arrested and indicted. Some of them at least. But none of the targeted high-level cartel figures have been arrested. So now we have over 1,000 firearms sold to Mexican cartels that are and Mexicans too, and they're purchased directly from the U.S. government. That's not good for PR. Not good. So guns tracked by the ATF, and this is how we know that they've been used to shoot and kill Americans. Guns tracked by the ATF have been found at crime scenes in both Mexico and U.S. In fact, there was one particular found at the scene where Agent Brian Terry, he was a United States Border Patrol agent. He was killed in December 2010 by one of these guns. And it was his death that brought this serious debacle to light. And I hate to call it a debacle because it's far more than that. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of ATF agents who thought that this was a bad idea to begin with began to speak up. they came forward to Congress in response and said, here's what really happened, but I never thought this was a good idea to begin with, but we had to do it because it was our job. So there's some reports, speaking of debacle, there are even some reports that the ATF found a gun runner, and they decided to let him off so that he would lead them to higher-ups in the Mexican cartel. And he led them to people, but it turns out that the men he led them to were already FBI informants. So that was not helpful. That's a good example of bureaucracies are competing against each other instead of working together. A former Mexican attorney general revealed later that related firearms from that ATF scandal have been found at crime scenes in Mexico, one where at least 150 Mexican civilians were either maimed or killed. Now, this obviously damaged our diplomatic relations with Mexico. The current Mexican attorney general has said that even while Americans were allowing guns to come into her country, she didn't even learn about Operation Fast and Furious until it hit the press. She said, quote, "At no time did we know or we were made aware that there might have been arms trafficking permitted. In no way we would have allowed this because it's an attack on the safety of Mexicans." End quote. Now, who sanctioned this? Well, obviously the ATF, of course, and the head of the ATF resigned. But the chairman of the House Oversight Committee and Government Reform, it's the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. There we go. The chairman of this committee traced the knowledge of this all the way up to former Attorney General Eric Holder, who at first claimed that he didn't know anything about it until very late in the investigation. But it was later revealed that he knew about it at least 10 months before that. So the ATF is under the direction of the Attorney General's office, which is the Justice Department. So that's how the Attorney General is involved. They're in charge of the ATF. And as Congress continued to investigate, they began to ask for documents to learn more about the sting. But the Justice Department, i.e. Eric Holder, would not release documents related to Project Gunwalker. In fact, Holder was so uncooperative that he was the first sitting cabinet member to be held in contempt of Congress in 2012. And on a side note, you won't have to know this for a test, but to be held in contempt of Congress, this is a power that Congress has. It allows congressional committees to compel agencies in hearings to cooperate with them. But that's a really rough definition, but Holder was required to cooperate to the best that he could. But prior to that, Holder had sent a letter to President Obama asking him to invoke executive privilege. So President Obama invoked executive privilege. Now, the damage is already done, and actually it's still being done with Operation Fast and Furious. We're still finding guns. But it seems that the House committee wanted to find out, and wants to find out now, exactly what Holder had to do with this. Specifically, what did he do to stop it when he found out about the sting? And what was his actions once he learned of what was going on? There's a particular document that Congress wants from the Justice Department that might shed some light on this matter. Unfortunately, they can't get their hands on it because of executive privilege. It seems that another issue here, though, is transparency and government trust. Well, public trust in the government. Just a year ago, in October 2014, another gun was found at a crime in Arizona. That gun was found to be purchased through the Fast and Furious scandal as well. Most of the information about the guns from this ATF operation haven't been, well, they've been brought forth mostly by this group called Judicial Watch. This is a nonpartisan organization, focuses on government transparency. Other than that, the Justice Department has been very uncooperative about Congress investigating the scandal even more. But some of the other stories in it are really interesting too, and like I said, it's almost like it's from a movie. So if you want to read more about the scandal, there are a couple of books available out there written by people who were allegedly directly involved in Operation Fast and Furious and who want the world to know what happened. Although I must tell you that it is their narrative It is not sanctioned by the government, and we may never know what really happened as long as executive privilege claim is held up. And so far, executive privilege claim has held up. So it worked in this instance. Both of these scandals, Operation Fast and Furious and Watergate, make executive privilege seem really underhanded. But consider this. Congress has a right to know what's happening. It's essential to their oversight of the other branches, to the separation of powers. But we all know that there are times when the president needs to discuss ideas or strategies, specifically about national security, and it must be kept quiet. Yeah, that's true. Sometimes. But on the other hand, you can't deny that executive privilege is a little suspicious. In fact, because it's suspicious in general, it's in no way a panacea, a cure-all, that is, to presidential political issues. What I mean by that is that when presidents issue executive privilege, it usually makes the public lose faith in the institution of the presidency. If our branches aren't transparent, then we might be inclined to think that, well, maybe they're doing something underhanded. Otherwise, why wouldn't the president be forthcoming? Executive privilege is something that's invoked when Congress gives a subpoena. So Congress has to subpoena an agency in order for executive privilege to be invoked. A lot of rules for something that's not actually real or in the Constitution. That's beside the point. So without the subpoenas, though, sometimes the president and other agencies respond by simply just not complying with Congress and their oversight procedures. Your book gives another example when agencies under President Obama has refused to turn over paperwork, like when the IRS was accused of targeting conservative organizations for auditing. This all looks really bad to the public, and a lot of presidential power is dependent on whether the public sees the branch as legitimate, whether or not they trust the branch. After the Watergate scandal, so many Americans lost faith in the presidency. So, when issuing executive orders or using executive privilege, the president has a lot to consider, has a lot of political factors to consider, like presidential approval ratings. If the president is in good standing with the public, he can often garner enough public support to compel Congress to follow through on his agenda and policies. President Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, was known for being able to garner tremendous public support with his persuasive rhetoric. Your book calls this the ability to go public, where a president will use his speech and other public communications to appeal directly to the citizens about the issues that he would like the House and the Senate to act on. So for Lyndon B. Johnson, his agenda was passing legislation on the war on poverty and even passing legislation on the 1965 Civil Rights Acts. To go public is a strategy that's unique to the executive branch, specifically unique to the president. So the executive branch has one person that is the president that the media can focus on, whereas Congress has 465 and then an additional 100 for the Senate. All this special media attention on the president allows the president a platform to go public. Sometimes this works, and it worked really well for LBJ. Although recently President Obama has tried to garner support for sweeping policy changes with gun control, and he's been really unsuccessful, likely because the public's not entirely ready to go along with those sweeping changes. Congress doesn't really have a reason to do anything about it. Well, they might have a reason, but for public approval's sake, they don't want to do anything too drastic. Sometimes it works to go public, and sometimes it doesn't. But one thing is true. The president needs the American people, the approval of the American people, just like every other branch. And it can be argued that the public approval is often what helps presidents expand their power. Your book doesn't say this, but it certainly alludes to it. Your book talks about presidential approval rating trends. I want you to look at how President Clinton's rating, what's in front of you right now, this is President Clinton's rating and how it was roughly even over his 2 terms. But we see President Bush, George W. Bush, his approval rating plummeted during his last term. Why? Well, as political scientists, we see trends, and here's what we found. Presidential approval generally spikes during a national crisis, and so for Bush it was the September 11th attacks. We call this phenomenon, and then he gets like a spike, this spike in approval. We call this phenomenon the rally around the flag effect. Now, Clinton never had such an incident in his term, but he did keep together a stable economy. Although, let me add a caveat, he kept a stable economy as much as any president can. Whether presidents directly affect the economy or not, we don't know, but the public certainly punishes and rewards the office for good and bad economic conditions. And the economy tanked in Bush's final term, remained consistently good in Clinton's term. But look here at Clinton compared to President Obama. President Obama approval rating went down sort of towards recently, rather, and the economy was not doing that well, not as bad as it was during Bush's terms, but not that well. And because the economy wasn't doing that well, that might actually account for the slight decline in the approval that you see with the Obama administration. The rally around the flag effect is a great demonstration of how public approval will allow the president tons of latitude in his duties, despite the limits that the Constitution places on his powers. But mainly, some political scientists argue that the real culprit for the expansion of presidential powers are the ambiguities in the Constitution. Let me say that again. The real culprit, according to some political scientists, for the expansion of presidential powers are the ambiguities in the Constitution about specifically what the president is supposed to do. So these ambiguities have enabled presidents to take unilateral action, basically changing policy on their own without consulting Congress or anyone else. Specifically, unilateral action is any policy decision made and acted on by the president and presidential staff without explicit approval, without consent from Congress. I mentioned that Congress could technically stop the president with legislation, perhaps, but the costs are often really high, and a lot of times those costs are how the public perceives the branch. It's not so hard to believe, though, that constitutional ambiguities are present in Article 2. We see that constitutional ambiguities are present in Article 1 and really present in Article 3. So it's present for all the branches. National security, though, is generally an issue most used to easily pass any constraints on presidential power. I can give you an example. When W was president, the Democrats wanted to stop the Iraq war by just cutting off funding. They said, stop the war. Public opinion said, stop the war. He didn't. So Congress said, we're going to respond by stopping funding. Bush supporters maintained what is called unitary executive theory. This is the idea that the vesting clause that we talked about earlier gives the president the authority to issue orders and policy directives, and in addition, these orders and directives cannot be undone by Congress. So, since the Constitution names the president the commander-in-chief, the president could still order forces to stay in Iraq, even without funding. So let's say that he orders them to stay in Iraq. Congress says we're not going to fund them. Who looks like the bad guy? Congress does, because we've got all these American troops in Iraq that don't have what they need. So, of course, Congress funded the soldiers. Along these same lines of presidential authority run amok is the idea that the president can interpret laws. Now, this is, when we think about interpreting laws, we think about what was the intent of Congress when they made it, when they made the law. And you would think that congressional intent would rest entirely with Congress, because it is called congressional intent after all. But the president can also interpret the laws, apparently. According to your book, and he gives a great example of this from the Reagan administration, current law requires the president to give congressional leaders the, quote, timely notification of secret intelligence operations. But in the Reagan administration, a lot of the leaders didn't do that. And when it was discovered by Congress that they weren't being alerted to these secret intelligence operations, they, of course, approached Reagan's administration, and the administration said, listen, you said timely notification, but what is timely notification? I really feel like we notified you in a very timely way. Sure, it wasn't before we did it, but it was pretty timely. So, after reading this chapter, there essentially seems to be no unified and accepted limits and constraints to presidential power, which may be very disconcerting to you, but we still do have constraints. So this is the end of the lecture. Remember that there are some parts of this chapter that we didn't cover, like the president in terms of his State of the Union address and what he can do there. So be sure to look at the rest of the chapter. And if you have any questions, you can notify me, email me. I'm always glad to answer.